Hello, welcome to my channel. Please like and subscribe. This story starts with a death. What? Doing something different, TMN? I hear your sarcasm, but let's continue anyway. Colonel Thomas H. Swope passed away October 3rd, 1909 at the age of 81. He was said to be one of the wealthiest men in the Midwest and a known philanthropist. Unknown just exactly how much he had, but it was thought his annual income was about $100,000. He had a lot of real estate, mainly in the area of Kansas City, Missouri, and even gave KC a park valued at $2 million, about 1,300 or so acres, called Swope Park. He also gave land on which the city hospital is located as well. His will left $40,000 to $45,000 worth of property to Park College. The president, Lowell M. McAfee, stated, quote, "Though I did not know Colonel Swope personally, I know that he was acquainted with Park College and had expressed interest in its work. 2 years ago, I was told by friends in Kansas City that the college was mentioned in Colonel Swope's will, but had no knowledge of the nature or amount of the reported bequest." End quote. The colonel had a 400-acre orange grove in Florida, a 400-acre farm near Columbia, Tennessee, plus property in Knoxville and Middleborough, Kentucky, vacant property in Syracuse, Lawrence, and Topeka, Kansas. Had mining claims near Butte. In addition, he had real estate in Kansas City, some in the business section of town, and a lot out of town. January 1910. So the colonel's death in and of itself didn't seem out of the ordinary for an 81-year-old man, at least not initially. He had shown no symptoms of an illness, and after swallowing a capsule, he had died while convulsing. So what changed? Well, let's just say there were 2 other deaths in the Swope family, and a $5 million estate. James Moss Hunton, his cousin and executor, died 2 days before the colonel on October 1st, 1909, allegedly of apoplexy. Apoplexy is unconsciousness or incapacity resulted from a cerebral hemorrhage or stroke. Hunton had been bled profusely, and after the removal of about 6 pints of blood, Dr. G.T. Twyman, one of the family's physicians, repeatedly protested to the other doctor present that too much blood had been removed. William Chrisman Swope, who I will call Chrisman from now on, another nephew, aged 30, died suddenly on December 2nd, 1909. So when you start to get bodies piling up, you either have a really bad coincidence or something else. The colonel's body has been exhumed and sent to Chicago, where Chrisman's body is already. Quote, "There is not a particle of doubt that both Thomas Swope and Chrisman Swope were poisoned. This fact had for its aim the extermination of all the Swope heirs," said lawyer John H. Atwood. You know, because if we get all the heirs out of the way, certain individuals left over will get a bigger piece of the pie. Keep that in mind. Apparently, a man already under suspicion and being observed had visited the office of a bacteriologist November 1909 in Kansas City and got some typhoid germs, as you do. The man told the bacteriologist, quote, "I am buying these merely to do some experimenting," end quote. Then this man visited the Swope home on Thanksgiving. Chrisman had developed typhoid fever, and early December 1909, he took a capsule and died convulsing. 8 more Swope family members would end up contracting typhoid fever in the month of December. Typhoid fever. Now, just what is that exactly? According to the World Health Organization, or WHO, it's, quote, "a life-threatening infection caused by the bacterium Salmonella typhi. It is usually spread through contaminated food or water. Once Salmonella typhi bacteria are ingested, they multiply and spread into the bloodstream. Urbanization and climate change have the potential to increase the global burden of typhoid. In addition, increasing resistance to antibiotic treatment is making it easier for typhoid to spread in communities that lack access to safe drinking water or adequate sanitation," end quote. It's only in humans. The bacteria is contained to the blood and intestinal tract. Horrible symptoms, as you can imagine, with anything hanging about in your intestines. Developing countries are the more likely to experience outbreaks of this. Antibiotics can usually take a hold of it, but even if you lose the horrific symptoms, you could still have the bacteria loitering about. All right, back to the story. We have 2 alleged poisoning deaths in the Swope family, 8 members who had typhoid early December 1909 but had recovered. It's January 29th, 1910, a couple of weeks later. The poison used on the colonel and Chrisman was strychnine. No arrest just yet, but we got the name of the suspicious fellow, one Dr. Bennett Clark Hyde. He had married the niece of the colonel. Her name was Frances. Her father is Logan Swope. And she was left $175,000 by her uncle. Dr. Hyde, Dr. Jekyll? No. Dr. Hyde was the attending physician of both the colonel and Chrisman. Dr. Hyde had signed the death certificates for both. Both certificates state the deaths were natural causes. Back on December 20th, 1909, Dr. Hyde allegedly got a little typhoid fever too, allegedly because he was taking care of the lot and contracted it himself. Well, Dr. Hyde doesn't like to be accused ahead of time, as he has been by the executor of Hyde's estate, John H. Paxton, and is suing Paxton for $100,000 in slander. Later, it was said to be about $600,000. Paxton has, quote, falsely, willfully, and maliciously, and intending to vex, oppress, and impoverish and wholly ruin, end quote, him, Dr. Hyde. I think Paxton basically said that Dr. Hyde was guilty of poisoning. This suit would be dismissed. February 10th, 1910 brings us to Executor Paxton filing information with the county prosecutor, charging Dr. Hyde with first-degree murder. Right now, only for the colonel. Dr. Hyde agreed to turn himself in. Judge Ralph S. Latschow wants a grand jury gathered to investigate. Though Hyde is only charged with the colonel's murder, the grand jury will look into the death of Chrisman also and the illnesses that many of the Swopes had gotten in December. It's suspected that the colonel and Chrisman were poisoned, the rest given typhoid, for the murderer to rid themselves of the principal heirs to the vast Swope fortune, which would have been his wife's if he had managed to get rid of everyone else. What is the accused Dr. Hyde saying? Quote, Colonel Swope died of apoplexy. There is no doubt about it. It was as plain a case of apoplexy as I've ever seen. Colonel Swope was getting old and feeble. He had been sick for more than 3 months of old age, lack of appetite, and senility. Only a few weeks before his death, he had a severe fall. Dr. Hunton's death was also due to apoplexy. He had the same symptoms and was affected almost exactly the same as was Colonel Swope. End quote. March 7th, 1910. So the grand jury has brought forward 11 indictments, charging Hyde with killing 3 members of the family, 2 murder, 1 manslaughter, and attempting to kill 8 others. On March 8th, he was released on a $100,000 bond. Now, I may have my information mixed up, but I thought if you were charged with murder, you couldn't get out on bond. But maybe because this is grand jury, it's different. Anywho, charges: first-degree murder of Colonel Thomas H. Swope, October 3rd. Chrisman Swope, December 6th. Manslaughter, J. Moss Hunton, October 1st. Poisoning, Margaret Swope, 3 counts by typhoid fever, November 25th. By hypodermic injections, strychnine, December 12th. By administration in strychnine and other poisons, December 18th. Margaret had also experienced convulsions after taking a capsule, but Dr. George Twyman had given her an emetic to induce vomiting, and she eventually recovered. By administration of typhoid germs to members of the Swope family and visitors on or about November 25th, the following: Lucy Lee Swope, Mildred Fox, Nora Bell Dixon, Georgia F. Compton, and Leonora Copperidge. March 28th. Now, we're not at the trial yet, but some nurses have spilled some tea. Dr. Twyman, family physician, had received word from nurses, and Dr. Twyman contacted Dr. Hyde to find out what on earth this information was about. Apparently, 5 nurses working with Dr. Twyman said that if Dr. Hyde remained in the house, they would leave. Dr. Hyde starts to head towards Dr. Twyman's office to discuss the matter, and when he reached into his vest pocket, he dropped something on the ground and stamped his foot on it. Thomas Swope saw this and later looked for the object and found the capsules. Thomas testified that the capsules appeared to be empty, but the capsules were sent off to Chicago. There is also some flippity-flopping about the scientist on our case, one of who is an old friend of the channel. Subpoenas to the scientists were trying to be served, but seemingly with little success. Edward Horatio, the subpoena server, testified, quote, "When I went out to subpoena Dr. Walter S. Haynes, Dr. Ludwig Hechtone told me he was out of the city. I then went over to his laboratories to see for myself. An assistant met me at the door and said, 'Dr. Haynes is out of the city.' I thought I'd better stick around and sat down on the steps of the laboratory. Pretty soon a student came out and I said, 'Is Dr. Haynes inside?' 'Sure,' he replied. 'He is just finishing his lecture to his class.'" End quote. Edward hung around for about a half hour when he saw Dr. Haynes poke his head out of the door and look around. Edward hid until Dr. Haynes was going down the steps. Quote, "The minute Dr. Haynes saw me, he started to run for the offices of Rush Medical College. I chased him and caught him just halfway up the stairs, but still he would not stop. I grabbed his coattail and hung on until he got to the office and tried to slam a door in my face." End quote. I'm not joking, but I would have loved to have seen that in person. Apparently, the subpoena server got in the room. Dr. Haynes said he wasn't the man he wanted. Dr. Ludwig Hechtone refuses to appear to testify. April 19, 1910, James A. Reed, Chief of Counsel for the state and Senator, addressing the jury in opening statement. Quote, "The death of Thomas H. Swope was consummated and planned by no one but a skilled physician. It was part of a general plan, the mainspring of which was the gaining of great wealth. The conception of it in the brain reckoned on the extermination of the entire Swope family. We shall endeavor to demonstrate by the acts of the defendant that the death of Thomas H. Swope is connected with a series of disasters that overwhelmed the Swope family, and we will do this to negative the possibility of mistake in the administering of the deadly drug that killed Colonel Swope." End quote. When speaking of the Colonel's last day on Earth, quote, "On October 2nd, Hyde talked with Swope for some time. No one but Almighty God and Hyde know what was said, but again that night, Hyde asked Miss Pearl Keller, a nurse, for her assistance. Next day, Hyde asked if Colonel Swope had had his breakfast and assured by Miss Keller that he had, remarked that he had a digestive capsule he wished to administer, and the two went to the sick room. And so poor old Colonel Swope took the capsule Hyde had given the nurse. Soon she had heard a muffled mumbling, and she turned and saw Colonel Swope in the midst of a convulsion. After that, the nurse called in Dr. Hyde. He immediately pronounced it a case of apoplexy. He said it was the same thing that Hunton had died with, but we will show you that it was something entirely different. The symptoms were entirely different. We will show you that Swope sank lower and lower until he died. He recovered consciousness only to cry out, 'I wish I hadn't taken that damned medicine.'" End quote. Senator Reed also claimed that Dr. Hyde had purchased the 5-grain capsules of cyanide of potassium, and then the next day, 5-grain Hollandan dyspepsia tablets some 18 days before Colonel's death. The defense is trying to say that Dr. Haynes lied about finding strychnine in Margaret's vomit, for lack of a better term, that Dr. Haynes was persuaded to by the executor John Paxton, that Lucy Lee Swope was not in Kansas when she got ill, that she had been in Paris and was doctored there. It was also said in contradiction that she was abroad when the colonel had died. She immediately came back to the U.S. She was met in New York by Dr. Hyde, who escorted her on the train and several times brought her water, and she got sick 4 days later. That the Swope family did not get any medical attention for their issues other than a man from Fort Scott who was posing as a South American, which sounds weird. That Mrs. Hyde acted as a suitable nurse in trying to help her family. That this whole thing started because Mrs. Hyde's mother, Mrs. Swope, believed her daughter Frances had spoke with Dr. Hyde, her husband, about relinquishing her claim on the part of the estate that was supposed to have been Moss Hunton's before he died. That Mrs. Swope had no interest in the colonel's health, and that the typhoid epidemic was at the fault of the Swopes, not Dr. Hyde. The Swopes' drinking water had been infected in the cistern by its nearness to an open cesspool. He said the scientists were paid employees of Mrs. Swope $100 to $200 per day for their services, that at the autopsy, integral body parts to the case were tossed and destroyed. The daughter of one of the Swope's servants, Miss Leonora Copperidge, admitted that her sister had typhoid fever in the spring of 1909, and that she had been ill with typhoid in December when she was cared for by her mother, who worked in the Swope household as a cook. When Dr. Frank Hall testified, he stated, quote, "The epidemic in the Swope home resembled a scientific experiment rather than a natural infection, and I told Mrs. Swope so." End quote. May 5th, 1910. So this is interesting. Though we're still on trial, all of a sudden Dr. Hyde has been locked up in jail. The coroner, Dr. Zwart, had just testified. Jury was let out, doors were closed. Judge Latshaw stated, quote, "In view of the testimony presented here, the court is compelled to say that it amounts to a presumption that under the law it deprives the defendant of the right to go on bond, and he is hereby and for that reason ordered remanded to the county jail." End quote. The jury was not to be informed of this decision. The druggist, Hugo Breckline, and two clerks spoke of Dr. Hyde's 3 visits to them and buying the cyanide in 5-grain capsules, stating it was to be used for killing cockroaches in his office. The druggist stated that in his 23 years of being a druggist, he had never known cyanide to be in capsule form. He had never sold it to doctors or for medical purposes. The jury was shown a cyanide capsule and the digestive capsule. They looked exactly alike. The bacteriologist, Dr. Edward Stewart, went on the stand. He remembered giving Dr. Hyde the germs and then later on hearing about the Swope outbreak of typhoid, wondering if he had unknowingly provided the means for them all to be ill. Executor John Paxton was on the stand admitting he had been paid $5,000 for his services. And Dr. Haynes is testifying. He tested 2 ounces of the vomit of Margaret Swope 10 days after receiving it and said there was no strychnine. Then he and another doctor tested a larger quantity and found strychnine. He then tested for cyanide, found nothing. Dr. Ludwig Hetton testified that the convulsions that the Colonel, Chrisman, and Margaret had suffered could have been from uremic poisoning, though he had already said that they were from the administration of convulsive and paralyzing poison or poison, so this is a little contradictory, but he said on review of the chart showing the history of the cases, he did not think uremia was present. The defense then used the doctor's own words from a book he had written in 1890, that his methods of conducting autopsies now was not the way he had stated to do them in his book. He said that the book had literally been written in the last century and he had changed his views. Even the newspapers are saying by this point things really aren't going anywhere, and the attorneys are digging at each other, and that's always fun. And speaking of scientific testimony with relation to the finding or not finding of poison in various body parts, Mr. Walsh, with the defense, mentioned the grand jury testimony. Quote, "Mr. Reed said he was going to prove that cyanide was found in the stomachs of Chrisman Swope and Thomas H. Swope, and by the grand jury testimony, quote, by the stolen grand jury notes, end quote," interrupted Mr. Conkling with the prosecution. Quote, "Who stole them? Stand up and say who stole them," end quote, shouted Mr. Walsh, shaking his fist at the prosecuting attorney. Mr. Conkling replied, quote, "I cannot say who stole them, but I can say who, after getting them in his possession, kept them against all morals and legal ethics," end quote. Mr. Walsh replied, quote, "I didn't take the notes. They were found and advertised in the newspapers 2 days. I went and got them, and I found that these scientists had sworn before God and man that no cyanide was found. It was my duty to my client to copy them, and I did it," end quote. Now, kids, geez. So we got more testimony. This is about May 6th or 7th, about how embalming fluid can contain formic acid and that cyanide of potassium can be formed from a combination of ammonia and formic acid. That the reason the cyanide wasn't found right away but was found weeks later was because the hydrocyanic acid had formed in the stomach of the colonel after the first test and after his frozen corpse had been thawed out. Another doctor had testified that he had seen convulsions and typhoid fever. A disease called meningism, aka meningitis, can accompany typhoid fever and can produce convulsions. May 11th, Dr. Hyde went on the witness stand, which apparently was a really huge mistake for him, and this is not the first time I've heard of a defense witness really doing himself a disservice by doing this. According to the Abilene Weekly Reflector, May 12, 1910, quote, "He had no plausible explanation for his purchase of cyanide of potassium in 5-grain capsules during the months of September and December of last year. But more than that, his own demeanor on the witness stand came close to being a body blow to his case. He was nervous, at times irritable, and plainly belligerent, pleading once for fair play when a tangle of questions presented itself and sparring for time by repeating interrogatories that were put to him before venturing to make a reply," end quote. One of the last witnesses of the trial is Mrs. Frances Hyde. According to admissions she made from the witness stand, it was she and not her husband who objected to the wooden cooler in the Swope home and introduced for her own particular use and that of her husband distilled water. She saw Dr. George T. Twyman, now dead, not able to testify, hold a string about the open vein in the arm of Moss Hunton and observed that he had power to staunch the blood at any instant that she announced that the throbbing sensation had left the sick man's head. She it was who arranged the hours of work for the nurses at her mother's home, so that no one nurse would have no one patient, but that all might take turns at looking after each of the sick people. It was she who talked with her mother in the presence of Miss Keller, the nurse, about having Dr. Hyde appointed as executor of the estate of Colonel Thomas H. Swope, and Dr. Hyde said nothing about his hopes and aspirations at that time. In fact, it was she who did everything about which the state is making its case against Dr. Hyde through the cloak of suspicion, except the injecting of camphorated oil into the arm of Margaret Swope and the purchase of cyanide of potassium in 5-grain capsules from the Brookline Drug Company. May 16th, Dr. Hyde was found guilty of murder in the first degree and recommended to life in prison. It took the jurors 3 days. Quote, "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree, as charged in the indictment, and assess his punishment at imprisonment in the state penitentiary during his natural life." Signed, Frank Claypool, Foreman. Judge Latshaw said that Dr. Hyde was to be sent to prison without bail. The defense is already stating they will ask for a new trial. One of the jurors admitted that Dr. Hyde's conviction is on himself, Dr. Hyde. There were actually 2 jury holdouts wanting to acquit. One of the jurors thought over the testimony, in particular Dr. Hyde's demeanor on the stand, and decided he was guilty. He convinced the lone holdout, and so came the verdict. Quote, "Dr. Hyde was his own worst enemy in the trial. His own testimony convicted him. When Dr. Hyde said he had bought cyanide for 10 years and could not remember where he bought it, he damned himself as a witness. If he had not testified as he did, I think he would not be in the position he is." End quote. Hyde's wife, Frances, would declare, quote, "I am now over the first shock and am strong. I am confident because Clark is innocent. It cannot be otherwise." End quote. She is very much the 1910 embodiment of the Tammy Wynette song, "Stand by Your Man." Frank Walsh, Hyde's attorney, said, quote, "Dr. Hyde is bright and cheerful. He feels the fight has just begun. This probably appears dark for us, but really I am more cheerful than I was the day the case started. The Supreme Court will treat us fairly." End quote. June 1910, Judge Latshaw says no to a new trial. The defense attorneys will file a motion of appeal to the Supreme Court, which the judge did expect and would allow. Quote, "The evidence demonstrated a plot or scheme. The definite manifestations or acts of which are so related to each other that they disclose a common motive and intent, prompted by avarice and cupidity running through all of these transactions, pointing to the ultimate design to obtain possession of the vast fortune of the deceased, through his wife, by the elimination of every human obstacle that might be in the way of their accomplishment as pawned from a chessboard. The court, after painstaking research of the law and careful consideration of the record, including the entire conduct of the trial, has found nothing that under the law of the land or the facts of the case leads the court to believe that the defendant did not have a fair and impartial trial, nor ought that would warrant or justify this court in granting the defendant a new trial, and the motion for a new trial herein is accordingly refused." End quote. I'm going to barrel through this a bit because this ain't our first rodeo. February 1911, the Supreme Court of Missouri is listening to the attorneys about getting a new trial. The basis for the pleas is partly on an attack of the toxicologists who were allegedly being paid for their skewing of the results. Also that the other deaths were being brought up by prosecution, though this case was solely about Colonel Swope. That the state's brief was anything but brief, a Stephen King-sized novel of 479 pages, and that had been a hindrance to try to read it only just the night before this trial. Then Senator Reed, back for the prosecution, spoke about the Swope family, the money, about the stupid reason for Dr. Hyde to buy cyanide for cockroaches, the witness who saw Dr. Hyde drop a cyanide capsule to the ground. April 11th, Supreme Court says yes to new trial, that the indictments were illegal and the evidence insufficient to support the allegations, that competent testimony was barred and incompetent testimony received, that prejudicial remarks were allowed by the prosecutor and by the court, that the court should not have revoked Hyde's bond during the trial, and that the verdict was the result of passion and prejudice. October 1911, Hyde has been out on $50,000 bail, spending most of his time in Michigan and the Northwest. November 1911, Senator Reed has some special words for the Missouri Supreme Court. Quote, "I will not bow to the dictum of any court that has never taken the trouble to read the record in a case on which it has passed." End quote. He's particularly ticked because the Supreme Court is ruling out all testimony regarding the death of Christmas Swope, who the Supreme Court has determined died of typhoid fever, not of murder. Also, no testimony will be allowed regarding the typhoid epidemic in the household or the bleeding death of Hunton, and probably not the illness of Margaret either. Second trial will have a change of venue at the defense's request with a change in judges. We're now with Judge E.F. Porterfield. December 14th. Well, we've already got a mistrial. Wait, how? We're not even finished with the trial. Well, that's because a juror escaped. You know, the whole court hootenanny. Though deputy marshals were guarding the jury in a hotel, somehow the juror was gone. He would eventually return, and Judge Porterfield found the juror insane, and the rest of the jury was discharged. The insane juror will not be punished and was allowed to go home, to go back to his work where he will likely recover better being out in the open air. Yeah, I kind of get that. So ends trial number 2. So the defense really didn't want this. They're saying now that this constitutes double jeopardy, going to yet another trial. And with the inadmissibility of a lot of the prosecution's testimony, they thought they had a sporting chance. 1913, trial number 3. This is going a little bit differently. This time, Judge Porterfield will allow testimony of one of the nurses working in the Swope home during the typhoid epidemic of December 1909. It had originally been ruled inadmissible by the Missouri Supreme Court, but the state's like, hey, we have new evidence about Christmas Swope's death, which Supreme Court had said was merely from typhoid fever, and it was allowed on those grounds. The nurse told how Dr. Hyde left the room just as she entered. Christman had convulsions shortly afterward. Hyde was called back, she said, and diagnosed it as meningitis and injected strychnine and cyanide. Swope died the next day. She also told about the sickness of Margaret Swope following the injection of supposed anti-typhoid serum. The state alleges pus germs were injected. March 1913. We're at closing arguments. The defense is throwing Mrs. Swope, that would be Frances's mom, some shade. Defense attorney Frank Walsh said, quote, "The whole case, gentlemen, hangs on one single hinge, the departure of Frances Swope Hyde with her husband from the Swope home the night of December 19, 1909. Mrs. Swope virtually has accused Dr. Hyde of trying to murder her family. When Dr. Hyde and his wife were ready to go, Mrs. Swope said, 'Frances, where are you going?' 'I'm going home,' was the reply. 'Why?' was the next question. 'Because I can't stay, since these dreadful suspicions exist against my husband.' 'When are you coming back?' the mother asked. 'When my husband can return with me,' Mrs. Hyde answered. There, gentlemen, you have the real beginning of this case, and that little woman has gone through the tortures of hell for the man with whom she left her mother's house that night. Taking it one way, with her out of this case, Hyde would be a free man. Taking it the other way, Hyde would be sacrificed. That's how much she is in the case. They say Mrs. Swope opposed the marriage of Frances and Dr. Hyde, but Frances Swope preferred to go to the man she loved rather than to a loveless marriage elsewhere." End quote. Apparently, in the 3 years after the marriage, Mrs. Swope never spoke to Dr. Hyde, and although there was some sort of reconciliation later, she never really liked him all that much. Well, jury could not come to an agreement. After deliberating for 86 hours, Judge Porterfield sent them on their merry way. Ballot number 1, 7 convictions, 5 acquittal. At the end of the 86 hours, 9 acquittal, 3 conviction. It was conveyed to the judge that no one was budging. Stick a fork in this jury, they are done. Trial number 4, January 1917. Actually, prosecution of the case was dropped today by order of Judge Porterfield. There is apparently no new evidence that would cause any hoopla or differences in the case from before. The case/trials against him have been circumstantial. State/prosecution has been unable to get funds to do a fourth trial. Quote, under the law, a defendant is entitled to a dismissal when the prosecution has continued the charges over more than 3 terms of court, end quote. April 1917, Judge Porterfield has dismissed the murder charge. It was said that the 3 trials cost the taxpayers about $30,000 each, so equaling $90,000 in total. Dr. Hyde paid his attorney Walsh $40,000 in one fee, the firm of Johnson & Lucas $10,000, R.R. Brewster $10,000, John M. Cleary $10,000, so $70,000 just in lawyer's fees. Hyde paid medical and chemical experts $20,000 and $5,000 for stenographic testimony. Plus the expense of bringing in witnesses from out of town, it probably been about $200,000 to keep him out of prison. You know how there was the horrible story about the movie Poltergeist being cursed? So Brookline, who had the drugstore, lost it due to fire. A juror from the first trial disappeared from Kansas City and has never been found. Dr. and Mrs. Hyde would have a baby while he was in jail, who would die shortly after birth. The second trial juror who had escaped was insane. Virgil Conkling, with the prosecution at the first trial, died. Dr. Twyman, who would have been an important witness for the state, died. Miss Van Noyce, a nurse and one of the state's witnesses, drowned while boating. Juryman in third trial was found beat up on the street and died days later. Friend of Dr. Hyde would kill himself. Yikes. So back to Mrs. Hyde and her standing by her man. Quote, 8 years ago, Kansas City Society asked of me, will you stand by your husband? I answered, I am his wife. Each succeeding year, the same question was asked of me, and I could find no other answer. To me, it was one of the wonders of the age that my friends, men and women with whom I was raised from childhood, should have asked me that they should have doubted. The bond which ties a woman to her husband cannot be qualified by suspicion of murder. Can't it, though? The good opinion of the world at large or the sincerity of her friendships, not even by her family ties. I knew my husband was innocent, but had I known him the crudest murderer in history, I still would have been his wife, and all that I had, even life itself, would have remained at his service. End quote. Well, after all of that, October 1920, Frances sues Dr. Hyde for divorce, alleging extreme cruelty and violence. She has also asked for custody of their 2 children, ages 6 and 4. She says she's able to financially care for and educate them, and that her husband is not. She also wants a restraining order. Quote, the defendant disregarded the duties of a husband and has been guilty of repeated and constant acts of cruelty and violence towards the plaintiff of such a nature as to endanger her life, and has applied opprobrious epithets to her and to her friends in the presence of their children. End quote. December 1920, she would get the divorce and get the custody. Dr. Hyde would move to Lexington, Missouri, and he practiced there until August 1934, when he died from a heart attack. Frances would pass away in 1964 at the age of 85. So, what are your thoughts? Do you think he did it? It's so hard to say when the only information you're really getting is coming from the newspapers, but it just sounds a little suspicious to me. But let me know your thoughts. See you.